Hello, Year 4. Trying out a different sofa in the quiet house. So, chapter 3 of Beowulf. It's quite a long chapter, so you'll have to be in for the long haul with this one. Okay? So, it's called A Fight in the Dark. Okay. The first night of our watch, all was quiet, and the second and the third were the same. Beowulf made use of the time, lost in thought, his head resting on his arms as he lay on the long benches in Hrothgar's hall. On the fourth day he called for long, sharpened wooden staves, such as might be found protecting a palisade. Puzzled, we gathered round our new leader. Our new leader outlined his plan. Some objected, but there was something about Beowulf's manner that quieted even the most vociferous of the Danes. Vociferous means talkative. Our chance to put the plan into action came that night. In the dim hours, we heard the now familiar snorting around the portal to the hall. Drunk on his previous conquest, the beast threw his weight against the door. There was no need, for this time it was unbolted. Lurching into the hall, Grendel let forth a bellow of rage and anger as he saw the warriors ranged before him, and leapt towards the nearest with unnatural agility. The bellow turned into a furious and concentrated roar as he met not with an ineffectual blade, and the satisfying crunch of bone between his teeth, but with the iron-banded end of a half-dozen staves wielded by hardened men who refused to quail before his grisly presence. The beast turned and launched himself at a group of Danes I was leading, but again met with a barricade of sharpened wood. Grendel swung his long clawed limbs in vain, and his furious howls grew shriller and angrier. The battle seemed like an eternity of darkness and tension, but we kept our discipline, and eventually Grendel tired. His swinging arm moved in a less deadly arc, and the slathering jaws were too weary to spew forth much venom and rage. The beast knew he would get no kill tonight, and turned to make his retreat. Beowulf seized the moment. As Grendel's back turned, he leapt atop the monster's shoulders and flung his arms around the enormous neck. Even with his great reach, the Geat could barely stretch around the beast's colossal frame. With a mighty bellow and a surge of new energy, Grendel threw back his shoulders and almost sent the Geat spinning from his perch. Beowulf kept his balance, but he was sliding from the beast's shoulders. As he slid, he managed to loop an arm around Grendel's shoulder and cling on. But even as he locked the monster's left arm, he was in grave danger from the swinging right. Grendel swung twice with his free limb, one swipe a hair's breadth from decapitating Beowulf, and the other striking a glancing blow that rattled the Geat's armoured helm. As the arms swung back for a third deadly blow, a figure detached itself from the flanks of stave-wielding warriors. Hansko seized the flailing arm and clung on. Pinned to the spot by battling warriors, Grendel had just one remaining course of action. With a mighty heave, he pulled Hansko towards his brutal cavern of a mouth. The young Geat stood no chance. No armour in the world could withstand those fangs. Hansko's last act was to ram his stave into the monster's baleful eye, moments before Grendel closed his jaws and the warrior met his end. The beast's howls as he registered his pain were piercing, but even they were drowned by Beowulf's deafening roar of fury as he saw the demise of his friend. Fired by anger and grief, the powerful warrior braced his feet against the mighty doorframe and pulled on the monster's shoulder with every last fragment of strength in his battle-weary muscles. Enraged and partly blinded, the monster recoiled and threw himself in the opposite direction. There was a gargantuan crack as the bone and flesh parted, and stentorian howls of anguish issued from the beast. Grendel leapt out of the doorway before we could follow, and Beowulf, with all his weight propelling him the other way, was flung head over heels onto a bench, where he lay momentarily stunned. In his hand, still twitching in a ghastly, ghostly way, was Grendel's arm. There was a momentary hush in the hall. Part exhaustion, part disbelief. Then, with a mighty shout, the warriors surged forward to acclaim their leader. Beowulf struggled to his feet, still bewildered. He pushed away his admirers and walked to the body of Hansko, his young follower. He cradled the youngster's head, brushed back the hair from his face, and closed the man's eyes. The simple display of respect and affection quietened the onlookers, who were growing rapidly in number as news of the triumph spread throughout the holding. But soon tongues were wagging again and the questioning resumed. By the time Hrothgar arrived at the hall to greet the exhausted warriors, a huge throng had already gathered, and wildly exaggerated tales of the fight were spreading. Hrothgar took his seat on his great chair with his counsellor, Aschir, by his side. The sea of folk in front of him swayed noisily back and forth, but he waited patiently. The mass parted at last to make way for a small knot of warriors, Danes and Geats both. This knot parted too, to reveal one man carrying a grisly trophy in both his arms. "Lord Hrothgar, I have failed you." Hrothgar appeared to mull over these words carefully for a while before replying. "In what way have you failed, Beowulf?" "I promised you the head of this creature that has plagued your hall," replied the Geat, masking a grin as he feigned deep sadness. "But see, I only bring an arm." "I think for now, Beowulf," Hrothgar said, "we shall let him keep his head, for you have rendered him armless." You see Hrothgar and Beowulf and the arm. Still going with this chapter. The warrior and the lord continued to look at each other, the corners of their mouths twitching. Hrothgar threw back his head and roared with laughter. He leapt from his seat and flung his arms around the exhausted Geat. Drinks here for the monster slayer," he shouted to his entourage, "and hang our trophy for all to see." A huge cheer rang around the room, and the hubbub swelled again around the party in the centre. It soon grew hot, and I still had the stench of blood in my nose, so I made my way to the great door. Dawn was breaking, bringing a magical glitter to frost on the hard ground. The early light picked out a trail of blue-black slime where Grendel's blood had pumped from his gaping wound. Not for a long time had the morning sun felt so good. The pain was something the monster had never felt before. He had known misery and hunger and loneliness, but never this white, hot, intense shock of ill-being. As he lurched away from the Iron Men's hall with his long strides, he heard an unfamiliar sound. It was his own breath, coming in ragged gasps as his lifeblood ebbed from the cavernous wound in his shoulder. Somehow he kept going, staggering through the mire and plunging into the stagnant waters above his home, drifting rather than swimming. He was unaware of how he got from the water to the floor of the murky cavern. The creature's eyes opened, gazed and unfocused. Another pair of eyes, watery, large and white, stared back. His last thought, as he slipped into unconsciousness and death, was of his mother. The celebration that followed that night was one of the grandest Hrothgar's had ever seen. The cooks laboured from dawn till dusk under Ash's supervision, and the singers and telltalers and other entertainers were summoned. Extra ale was begged from smaller villages and halls nearby, and 2 of the finest prize pigs were chosen to be roasted for the centrepiece of the feast in Beowulf's honour. Grendel's torn arm was sewn up and nailed above Hrothgar's seat for all to see. The cook's helpers spent almost as much time chasing wide-eyed children away from this freakish sight as they did stirring and chopping and fetching and carrying. The feast began not long after dark. The Danes were seated and I was sent to fetch the Geats from their quarters. As Beowulf entered the room, all eyes turned to him. He walked forward down the ranks of seated warriors. As he passed each table, those warriors stood and clashed their beer mugs loudly on the table and stamped their feet in approval. By the time he reached Hrothgar's chair, the clamour was deafening. The tankard slammed in time as the Geat's name echoed over and over again in a rhythmic chant of approval. When Beowulf reached the top of the hall, even Lord Hrothgar stood. Smiling, the chieftain, most powerful in the Danish lands, held his hands aloft for silence. It came eventually. Hrothgar stepped to the side of his great carved chair. He gestured to his ally to sit. "Tonight, my friend," said Hrothgar, "the hall is yours." Beowulf looked embarrassed, but he could hardly refuse such an honour. He nodded to Hrothgar and took his place in the great carved seat. The feast was long and noisy and hot, and it was a relief when all the food was done and we were able to push back the chairs and enjoy the entertainment. The songsmiths and lawmasters tried hard to outdo each other with absurd and inaccurate versions of the fight. As the last one quieted, a sharp voice piped up from behind Beowulf's left. "Which one of these gaudy tales pleased you the most, friend Beowulf?" asked the voice. I looked at the speaker and frowned, for it was Unferth, one of Hrothgar's favourite. A fondness for ale had reduced his worth and made him bitter and twisted. There was now an undercurrent to his words. "Be careful how you reply, Beowulf," I cautioned the Geat. "This Unferth, he thinks himself a wit and he likes to throw words around." Unferth fixed his weaselly eyes on me. "I would beware if I were you, young Wiglaf," he sneered. "Beowulf has a bad record for keeping his adoring young followers alive." One or 2 of the Geats sprung to their feet at these sour words, ready to remonstrate with Unferth, but Beowulf motioned them to sit. He took a slow drink and fixed his eyes piercingly on the spiteful Dane. "Your point is, Unferth?" "My point is that you are happy to take all the credit for this triumph, when in fact it is your dead sword mate who should be receiving the accolades. It seems the great Beowulf is happy to let his friends die for him and enjoy the applause. Beowulf looked calmly at Unforth, but I could see he was struggling to retain his poise. Someone had to deflate the tension of the situation. My lord, Hrothgar, I started, I beg your permission to add one more story to the evening's entertainment. Unferth is right that young Hansko should be given the honour at this table. So I would honour him by telling how he came to be at Beowulf's side, a tale I heard from his own lips on the sea crossing. Hrothgar was wise, and he saw my plan immediately, nodding his assent. Hansko was a good, young man, keen to learn and eager to please. He was turning into a fine warrior. He could even write and read a little, setting him apart from the others. One day his camp was raided, but Hansko was one of the fortunate ones. Knocked unconscious by a lucky blow, he lay stunned throughout the brief fight as the raiders ransacked and looted his grandfather's holding. His family were killed and almost all his friends. Hansko and two other raiders were bound, their wrists tied, ready to be sold as slaves by these raiders. The scum were still celebrating a good day's work when a hunting party fell upon them. With only 3 companions, the leader of the newcomers led an assault on the heavily armed campsite and the vile bandits. The cowardly looters fell before the heroes like wheat before a scythe. For this was Beowulf the Geat, and at his back was Scaife One Eye, his 2 swords flickering like tongues of crackling steel flame. The raiders would kill their prisoners rather than lose them, and Hansko's 2 companions were killed where they lay. A sword rose for a 3rd stroke. The fighter, wielding it, paused, and a look of amazement crossed his face. Sorry, across his face. No hand held the huge axe that had struck him. It had been thrown from a full 20 yards away. The raider sank to his knees and died. Moments later, Hansko felt his bonds loosen and a voice said, "Follow, boy. Stay close." Seizing the dead raider's sword, Hansko did as he was told. The odds still looked grim. One of the Geats was down and three remaining, plus Hansko was surrounded by 20 or more fighters. Beowulf shrugged off his shield and hefted his great war axe in both hands. Hansko glared at him. Beowulf had a strange but calm look about him, a look that held no recognition of danger or fear, and no consideration for the concepts of defeat or death. Scaife One Eye had a wilder look, his mouth pulled back in what could have been a snarl, but just as easily have been a grin. The 2 looked at each other, nodded, and charged. The fight lasted moments. The moments it took for the 2 heroes to cut down a half-dozen men. This is how Hansko was rescued by Beowulf. Little wonder the youngster was all too happy to lay down his life to his friend and mentor. I ended with a glare at Unforth, challenging him to mock, but he merely scowled into his beer and sat back. I caught Beowulf's eye, and he acknowledged me with an almost imperceptible nod of the head. With the good mood restored, the drinking continued. Hrothgar announced that there would be gifts for the Geats, and helmets and weapons were brought forth from the armoury in payment for their courage. Beowulf tried to wave away the gifts, but Hrothgar was insistent. "This is a small price to pay for keeping my kingdom, my friend," he assured the Geat with a smile. "And tomorrow you shall have the finest gift I can bestow, a horse from my own private stables." With these words he clapped his hands, and the ladies of the court came forward with gifts for the Geats. Jewels and finely sewn tunics were brought out, and scented by the Queen's own hand. "Gifts for your wives at home," she explained. The Danes roared their approval of the Queen, and she bowed out the hall with her ladies. The next visitor was also female, but she announced herself very differently. The door was smashed in, and the bodies of the knight's sentries were flung into the room. Then Grendel's mother strode through the opening, howling and spoiling for blood. She swung her arms at the nearest table, smashing men, tankards, and food platters to the ground. All eyes were facing front now, as the Danes took in the full view of their latest nightmare, standing in the hall, baying her grief and her thirst for revenge. Scaled and armoured like her son, Grendel's mother was a full head taller, if slimmer. Her limbs too were sleeker. There was no mistaking who she was. Her face was leaner, and her yawning mouth was not as wide as her son's, but the teeth were like 2 rows of sharpened daggers, and as if to demonstrate their keenness, she seized Aschir, who was standing near the door, and killed him. She tossed him aside and seized 2 more helpless victims. She strode off into the night, one under each arm, bellowing her fury. Hrothgar sat with his head in his hands, rocking back and forth, unable to believe that the ravages had begun all over again, and stricken with grief for his dear old friend. Everyone was shouting. Fear and panic had gripped the room. One man alone was calm. Beowulf sat impassive in his chair. He looked at Scaife and raised an eyebrow. I can't raise just one. Scaife grimaced and nodded in unspoken consent, slipped quietly from his seat and out of the room. The Geat went to Hrothgar and lifted his head, holding it in his great hands. "I had begun to suspect as much, Lord Hrothgar. Your wise men are fools," he said firmly. "They too should have guessed. However inhuman and vile a monster, it must have had a mother. And however inhuman and vile the mother, it will always feel love for its child." "But what are we to do?" Beowulf asked Hrothgar faintly, almost pleading with the Geat. "We kill her," answered Beowulf. "Even now Scaife tracks the beast to her lair. She feeds at night, so we shall find her in the daylight when she is weakest. Grendel's mother dies tomorrow." There she is. Right. Leave it there until chapter 4.